InFi, episode 37.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance, hosted by American economist and author Dr. Robert Murphy. Each week, tune in for dynamic discussions with business pioneers about emerging trends in finance, life insurance, asset management, technology, and more. Now, let's talk the future of finance.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the InFi podcast. Today I'm going to be going solo. I'm going to expand upon a recent article I wrote for the Infineo website. Of course, I'll link to that in the show notes page if you want to see it in its original glory. But the big picture here is there was recently a documentary put out by the MMT crowd, Modern Monetary Theory, called Finding the Money. And it was very well done. I'll also link to, I gave it on a different podcast, I gave a full 90-minute response video to their full documentary. And so I can link to that if you're curious. But for today's purposes on InFi, I want to go through one particular element of that, namely, why is it that if the U.S. government can print new dollars, and by print we also mean electronically issue them with no constraints, then why does the Treasury issue new bonds to borrow U.S. dollars from people in the private sector? Why do they go through that if they can just print money? And so that's the issue. All right. And so if that's whetted your appetite, let's dive right in. So again, the issue here is for what an MMTer refers to as a monetary sovereign, a government like the United States or the UK or Japanese governments, where they have a fiat currency. It's not tied to gold anymore. There's no constraints in terms of how many they can create of these monetary units. Why are they also engaged in massive borrowing? Why do they keep issuing new debt such that fiscal hawks point and say, oh my gosh, look at the national debt. This is getting out of hand. Something's going to happen. We're going to have a debt crisis. Right? So the MMT camp thinks that's crazy. And they're not saying, oh yeah, just run the printing press and nothing bad ever happens. They acknowledge you could have inflation if you overdo it, by which they mean rising consumer prices. But they're saying this focus on that debt's crazy. And one of the ways in this new documentary that they seemingly illustrate that the conventional Orthodox economists don't know what the heck they're talking about is they feature clips from interviews that the documentary makers conducted with some of these establishment figures. And so one in particular that went viral when they pulled, this MMT documentary came out, I believe, in early May 2024. And then as part of the promotional effort, they pulled out a little snippet from this particular part of the interview with Jared Bernstein. And so who Jared Bernstein is, right now, he is the head of Biden's Council of Economic Advisors. And so he's, fairly high up on the food chain as far as this stuff goes. And so we'll play for you in a minute here just so you can see why this clip was going viral, because it's hilarious. The question was posed to him, if the U.S. government can just print new dollars, then why is the Treasury going out and always borrowing dollars from the private sector in order to, cover the budget deficit for that period? Why do they do that? Why don't they just create the new dollars? Okay, and so here is his attempts to answer that fairly straightforward question.
Today, I nominate Jared Bernstein, an old friend who's been with me a long time, a brilliant thinker.
White House economic advisor Jared Bernstein joins us now from the White House.
Thanks so much. The U.S. government can't go bankrupt because we can print our own money.
It obviously begs the question, why exactly are we borrowing in a currency that we print ourselves? I'm waiting for someone to stand up and say, why do we borrow our own currency in the first place?
Like you said, they print the dollar. So why does the government even borrow?
Well, again, some of this stuff gets, some of the language and concepts are just confusing. I mean, the government definitely prints money, and it definitely lends that money, which is why the government definitely prints money, and then it lends that money by selling bonds. Is that what they do? They sell bonds. Yeah, they sell bonds. right? Because they sell bonds and people buy the bonds and lend them the money. Yeah. So a lot of times, at least to my ear with MMT, the language and the concepts can be kind of unnecessarily confusing, but there is no question that the government prints money and then it uses that money to, they print money and they use that money to, they sell bonds, they borrow. I guess I can't really talk. I don't get it. I don't know what they're talking about. Like, because it's like the government clearly prints money. It does it all the time, and it clearly borrows. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this debt and deficit conversation. So I don't think there's anything confusing there.
Okay, so that's pretty funny. And you can understand why the people who are either outright MMTers or sympathetic to their cause are thinking that was a PR victory for the MMT camp, right? Because if their position is the Orthodox approach is crazy, they're treating the government as if it's a big household or even a big corporation where, hey, before you can spend money, you have to first get it from somewhere. And if your income is insufficient, then you got to go borrow it. And that's the way you make ends meet and satisfy the bottom line and so forth. But those rules don't apply to monetary sovereigns, right? That's the MMT position. And so it's crazy for us to think like that when it comes to, for example, the US government. And so when Jared Bernstein, the head of Biden's Council of Economic Advisors, is fumbling around like that, then it looks bad for the Orthodox economists and good for the MMTers. A couple of points before I move on to the meat of this. Bernstein is not a trained economist. Okay, so I'm not trying to be a credentialist and just say, oh, only if you have a PhD in economics are you allowed to. I'm not saying that, but I am saying, just to be clear, it's not shocking that he doesn't know what the heck he's talking about. That he doesn't. My understanding, I don't even think he has an undergrad degree in economics. Okay, he certainly does not have a PhD in economics. Okay, so that's one thing. But beyond that, the reason I'm okay with going along with this and people kind of chortling at the guy is it's not just that he didn't know the answer. If you watch that carefully and look at his body language, he's just bluffing at the end. Like he started out and said, yeah, the US government can print dollars and that's why it lends, because that's normally what you would think, right? If you're the fountain from which all new dollars come, then you would think you'd be lending that out, right? But no, what the issue is, why do they borrow it? So he right off the bat was wrong. And then he was walking through and realized his mistake. He's like, oh, wait, yeah, because if you issue bonds, then you're getting money. Oh, yeah, so the public is buying. Okay, yeah, right? And so he's talking himself through it. And then near the end, when it's clear he doesn't know what the answer is, he just says, well, because the U.S. government's doing it, there must be a reason for it. And yeah, it's not confusing at all. And then he goes and grabs and drinks his cup of coffee. Okay, so there he's clearly like ending the discussion, making it look like there's no big deal when it's obvious he has no idea. All he's done is sort of brought up the paradox himself as he tried to reason through it. And then instead of just saying, you're catching me off guard here with the camera rolling, I probably am not making a good presentation of it, but I'll get back to you on that. That's good. I've actually, I never really thought that through. That's funny. I'm sure there's a reason, but he didn't say that. If he had said that, then I would feel more sorry for him and the people dunking on him online. But no, he didn't. He just, yeah, there's nothing confusing here. And then he went and did a power move and took a swig of his coffee to end the discussion. So that's why, like I say, I don't feel particularly sorry for him, the fact that so many people are passing that clip around. Okay, but on to the substantive issue. So let me now, in this episode of the InFi podcast, try to explain why is it that even though certain governments have the legal ability to issue fiat money, why might they want to have the option of financing government expenditures by issuing bonds and borrowing some of the money rather than just printing it up fresh? All right, so that's the question. Now, with all this stuff, let me just give a caveat here, and then I won't dwell on this further. I'm going to answer this question as if I were more of a mainstream Orthodox economist, as opposed to, as some of you may have gleaned, or if you knew me from before this podcast launched, that I'm a pretty staunch libertarian economist, right? And so in terms of what I think the proper scope of government is, it gets very small down to we're butting up against Planck's constant. Okay? So with all these things, I hope it's not coming off that I'm saying it would be a good thing if the government spent $1 trillion doing X, Y, and Z and financed it via borrowing. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying in this podcast is, given for the sake of argument that the government is going to, say, spend $1 trillion on going and fighting Putin, that's the example I used in the Infineo article, so I'll just work with that here too, just for consistency. Then there's different ways the U.S. government could finance that $1 trillion expenditure. And that's what we're focusing on. And there's pros and cons, if you will, or there's at least different impacts depending on which method of finance the government uses. Right? So here, I'm not saying it's a good thing if the government does this activity in the first place. I'm just saying, given that it's going to do it, does it matter how the expenditure is financed? And that's what we're focusing on. So as we'll see, there's a pretty straightforward answer. And let me just anticipate, ironically, even though the MMTers were passing this clip around to show what an idiot Jared Bernstein was, because, he doesn't know, it's clear a lot of the MMTers also either think there is no reason or they give a different explanation for why the government does this than the one I'm going to give in this episode. So I think it's ironic that the MMTers who are dunking on Bernstein, because he doesn't know why the government would do this, or in many other cases, he doesn't know that there is no explanation, that this is just stupid. This is a relic from the gold standard era that they also don't know. All right. The explanation I'm going to give in this episode. And then, of course, the MMTers would just point to this episode to say, yep, this guy Murphy, even though he has studied our works and listened to our interviews, still doesn't get it. What a fool. Okay. So before jumping into the main topic of why would the U.S. government, just to make it more specific, borrow U.S. dollars from the public to cover a budget deficit when it could obviously just turn to the Fed and say, just create those dollars. Why would it do that? I think it's useful to first focus on a related problem, but distinct, and to say, if the U.S. government can levy taxes on U.S. citizens and receive dollars that way, why would it ever elect to resort to deficit finance, floating bonds, as opposed to just raising taxes, right? So assume the printing press isn't an option right now. And so the U.S. government, again, the scenario is they want to go fight Putin and they need $1 trillion right now to go buy extra, pay for contracts to make more tanks and fighter jets and expand the ranks of the Marines and so forth, buy more bullets and whatnot. Okay, so suppose the U.S. government needs $1 trillion right now to bulk up the U.S. forces to go across the ocean and go show Putin who's boss. And there's, at this stage right now, we're putting aside the printing press as an option, and we're just saying the government could just levy a one-time surtax and raise the $1 trillion that way, or it could conceivably issue extra bonds, like have the U.S. government go deeper into debt and raise some or all of the money that way in order to come up with this $1 trillion to, pay the defense contractors and so forth. Okay, so that's what we're going to analyze. And as I explain in the article, that here my views have been sharpened by Ludwig von Mises, the great Austrian economist. And he actually, back in 1918, I came across an address he gave in Vienna to the people. I don't know if it's what the right term would be in terms of what their governmental structure was, but the people running the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay, so you remember in 1918's, after most of World War I, and Mises is talking about the issue of financing the war effort. And so first he says, in terms of real resources, and in economics, when we use the word real, we mean we're not talking about monetary. We're talking about like actual goods and services. Okay. Sometimes it could mean inflation adjusted too. Like if it's numbers, like if you say my income in real terms was $50,000 for the last 3 years, like you mean I'm adjusting for inflation. But they all kind of dovetail with each other because real is supposed to be referring to the real physical goods and services as opposed to just money terms, which could be inflated literally based on the printing press. Okay. So Mises is saying in terms of the real goods and services that are needed to wage the war effort, clearly the present generation has paid for the war, right? Because all of the, steel and iron and glass and rubber and fuel and so forth, and labor hours as well, all of that stuff that was channeled into the war effort on the Austro-Hungarian side during the war was not available for civilian use, right? But just by definition, but by sheer logic, right? And so for every extra batch of bullets that were sent to the front, the civilian goods that could have been produced with that material instead now isn't produced. All right, there's scarcity. It's not that the economy can just create an infinite amount of goods. If it's going to focus on wartime production, then that means civilian output has to shrink accordingly. And so Mises is saying, we don't have a time machine. It's not that we can suck potential production from 30 years in the future and bring it to the present and use it to make more rifles or artillery shells today. Right? So there's a sense in which it's the present generation that's bearing the full economic cost of the war in that sense. Now, he does have an aside, and he says, there is a sense in which future generations are poorer because of this war, but that's because we're going to bequeath fewer houses and other types of durable civilian goods. Because, right, we didn't build as many houses in the last few years as we otherwise would have had this horrible war not broken out. That's the idea. Little asterisk, I'm not going to go off on a tangent here. There's a subtlety there where I actually was criticizing Mises. I think there actually is a sense in which even unborn great-grandchildren could, in a sense, partly help fund the war effort. And so the article I'm going to link to, if you want to go look at it, I get into that. But you can go look and just see Mises, and I get the links to the original article. If you want to go look at Mises' original, it's translated into English, obviously, if you want. Okay, so I'm just here giving a quick little aside, but forget that. That's a very complicated, nuanced asterisk. The main point being, Mises is saying, in terms of the opportunity cost of channeling our scarce resources of manpower, raw materials of nature, so forth, semi-finished goods, we have some options. And if we channel them into making more things that are needed for the war effort, then that necessarily means we can't make as much in terms of output for the civilian sector on the home front, right? Okay. But he says, having said that, there still is a role for the government's fiscal policy. When we talk about how are we going to, quote, pay for the war, he said, usually what people have in mind is that burden that I just established collectively falls on the present generation entirely. Still, the government's fiscal policy in terms of how do we finance the war could affect the distribution of that burden and how does it impact certain households. Okay? And he said, so, for example, one option would just be to have the government say, well, this is the explicit cost of the war. Actually, let me back up. Well, one option, I don't even think I mentioned this in the article, so this is interesting just to show you up. One thing would be for the government to say, we're not going to use money at all. If we need a bunch of, I guess they're probably in the beginning using a lot of horses. If we need a bunch of horses to put them in the cavalry, we'll just go and commandeer them. If we need a bunch of fuel, for the vehicles, we'll just commandeer it. And actually, the labor, they did do that. They drafted people, right? It wasn't a volunteer army where they paid market wages to get people to volunteer. So I'm saying the approach they took with the labor to get the infantry to bulk up and go get marched into those killing fields and those meat grinders and some of those awful fronts that you may know about if you read about World War I. That is the approach that the various belligerents used. They just drafted young men, and in some cases, as the war endured, older and older men, and threw them at the front lines. Okay, but there also was a lot of market activity where the government would first raise funds and then go buy items in the marketplace, and that's how it would acquire them. Okay, so for that element of its operation, so Mises points out, why wouldn't you just have the government just go and commandeer stuff? Well, because then production would cease, right? Like if you're somebody refining crude oil into gasoline or whatever was needed back then to run the vehicles and such, if the government just comes in and just anytime you had any inventory in your warehouse of refined gasoline, the government just came in and just confiscated and said, hey, we need it for the war. You got to do your part. Stop complaining. Well, then you obviously would stop going out and buying crude oil from other people and refining it, right? And the same thing with other areas where there's production is involved, where you have to go as a business and get inputs and then transform them into finished outputs, like to go create more rifles. If the government just came in and seized your inventory periodically, you would stop making more rifles. Why would you keep doing that? Okay, and so that's why that wouldn't work. And also, too, there's a sense in which that would be unfair, right? Then you would be, it's true, the present generation collectively is funding the war efforts, paying for it in terms of other potential goods and services that could have been produced for civilian use now aren't. But you could see how there, the brunt of paying for the war would have fallen most heavily and been concentrated on those people who happened to be in the line of work that was needed for the war. All right. And so that might be considered unfair. And so that's why it would be fairer, instead of the government just confiscating everything periodically and sending it to the front, to rather raise funds and then go buy it voluntarily. Okay. So there, Mises says, what if they just levied explicit taxes on everybody? So for whatever the monetary cost of the war is, what if the government just went out and levied a tax? So here in the article, I reverted to, instead of like picturing Mises talking, because also it gets a little cumbersome because I don't know, like they only introduced tanks near the end and it wasn't even clear if the Austro-Hungarians had tanks or not. So let's just fast forward to something that we're more comfortable with and we can picture the U.S. government spending $1 trillion to raise a new force to go fight Putin. Okay. Again, not that I think it ought to do that. And so the idea is if they had to come up with $1 trillion, one way is just to levy a surtax. So let's say they looked at last year's tax returns and they took the wealthiest 100 million filers of personal income tax returns, last year's records. And then they just said, everybody who did that, you each owe this one-time surtax of $10,000, in addition to your other tax bill or whatever. But right now, we just found all those names, all those households and each of you owes us $10,000 extra, right? And you have 3 months to pay it because we got to come up with this $1 trillion to buy all this stuff to go fight Putin. Okay, they could do that. But the problem is, and I'm just adapting Mises' discussion back in Vienna in 1918 to a more modern example, is just think that through. A lot of those households in that dragnet of 100 million filers don't have an extra $10,000 just sitting around that they could just say, oh yeah, right now I've got 18,000 in checking. Let me go ahead and program that and pay it to the IRS. Oh, now I only have 8,000. No, most people don't have an extra 10 grand just sitting around. And so what could happen is many of them, they could really restrict their consumption. Most American households, if they really had to, we'll put it this way, most American households over the next 3 months, right, because that was the window I kind of just pull out of the air to say, suppose they're given 3 months to come up with 10 grand in this surtax. Most American households right now, especially, like I say, if you went and looked at all the income tax filers and took the wealthiest top 100 million of them, most American households, probably over a 3-month period, have a gross income or even an after-tax income above $10,000 over that 3-month period, right? And so if they needed to, they probably could restrict their consumption and come up with that money. Now, maybe in some cases it means they would have to sell off the family car or whatever, but the idea being that they probably could do it, but it would be very painful for a lot of them. And so rather than come up with that extra $10,000 over the course of 3 months, like an unexpected bill that they get from the IRS, just by restricting their consumption, probably what they would do is spread the pain out over time. So instead of paying for that new tax bill out of current consumption, out of current income, instead they would turn to the credit markets. So like if they had room on their credit cards, they might just throw it on the credit card and then try to knock that down over the next 3 years, let's say. Or they might turn to some other thing. If it was somebody who owned a farm, one option would be to sell the farm and come up with the money that way and then keep the rest of the farm sold for a lot more than $10,000. But probably they don't want to do that. They probably want to sell their farm just to pay this tax bill. So they would probably go to like a commercial bank or some other lender, pledge the farm as collateral and come up with the 10 grand that way. And then they had the lien against their property and then they would try to pay that off over time. Okay, so that's what would happen in practice if the government did that. And so Mises is saying, notice there, what's happening is the people, the owners of the liquid capital, the ones who are the lenders in the credit markets in that scenario, are the ones who are, in a sense, coming up with the money to fund the war effort, right? So the $1 trillion that the Treasury is collecting in this scenario through levying just an explicit tax on everybody, that extra $1 trillion is coming from the private sector. And ultimately, it's the checking account balances being drained of the owners of liquid assets who are extending the loans to the people who have relatively illiquid assets or who don't have any, and they're just like pledging some of their future income. Okay? And so Mises is saying, instead of doing that, it's in some sense equivalent, but it reduces the friction and possibly the unfairness of it if the government instead borrows a bunch of the money. So in our example, suppose the government just levies a surtax of a total of 100 billion, right? So now each family, each household that I mentioned before only has to come up with an extra $1,000 over the next 3 months. And then the government borrows the other 900 billion, right? So the government still comes up with the extra $1 trillion in present funds to pay to the military industrial complex. But what if instead of just levying the full surtax to tax it all right now, instead it only taxes 100 billion and it floats new treasury securities, new bonds to the tune of 900 billion, right? So the budget deficit, boom, is $900 billion higher that year. And the federal debt is $900 billion higher than it otherwise would have been. But then next year, right? So it was just a one-shot $1 trillion expense. Putin is defeated. The world is made safe for democracy. And truth, justice, and the American way prevail. Okay. And so then next year, the government keeps that $100 billion surtax for the, Putin effort in place. It raises another $100 billion in revenue over and above what otherwise would have happened. And then it uses that to knock down, to retire some of that federal debt. And it just does that for 10 years. So at the end of the first year, the federal debt's $900 billion higher than it would have been. Then it gets whittled down to 800, 700, 600, right? And so after the full decade of that $100 billion annual surtax, the debt is, the excess debt is paid off, right? So it's not that the federal debt's paid off, but the federal debt at that point is where it would have been in the alternate universe where they didn't have that extra $1 trillion expense to go fight Putin. Okay. For this discussion, I'm ignoring interest charges. Okay. So you could tag that on to make it more accurate, but I'm abstracting away from that just to make sure everyone's getting the basics. Okay. So they could do that too. And Mises' point was, in a sense, it's either way, it's still ultimately in that first year, it's the owners of the liquid assets who are restricting their potential consumption and the ones who are genuinely paying for the war. And other people are not the ones cutting back their consumption. Okay, because again, remember, most households, if hit with that $10,000 surtax and said, you have 3 months to come up with this, they probably could do it. They probably, they would certainly stop going out to eat. They might just eat rice and beans. Again, they might, if they had been planning on buying a new car, so they certainly defer all those purchases, certainly not going to go on vacation, not going to buy new clothes. Right? So most households could just greatly restrict their standard of living in order to come up with an extra $10,000 over a 3-month period. But in practice, most probably wouldn't do that. Just like in the real world, if you got hit with an unexpected $10,000 medical bill, you might not just pay that off right away. You might pay it off over time just because that's less painful. And just like in general, you and your spouse, you're a young couple and you want to go buy a house, you might take out a mortgage, right? So why do you do that? Is because it's less painful for you to finance it over a 30-year period or whatever, 15-year period, than it is to come up with the cash to buy the house outright at the moment. Okay? So that's the social function of credit markets, of linking up lenders and borrowers, is people rearrange their consumption flows. And so people who are relatively well endowed with liquid assets in the present effectively sell that off in order to have a higher consumption over time. And then the borrowers, what do? They are selling off, they're reducing slightly their future flows of consumption in order to have a lot more consumption right now. Right? You get the house right now, and then you pay it off over a 30-year stretch or whatever. Right? And so because you have to make the house payment, your standard of living is lower in those future years based off of your gross income than what you otherwise would have expected. Right? You can't go on a vacation or something because I got to make the mortgage payment. But the benefit was you got your house up front. Okay, so that's what credit markets do socially, is they just help lenders and borrowers rearrange the timing of their income and expenditure flows. Okay? And so, again, Mises is saying either way, when we say that, adapted to our present example, if the U.S. government is going to spend $1 trillion making more tanks and bombers and fighter jets and having troops go into, ultimately, Americans, that means there's fewer civilian cars being made. There's fewer factories being built. There's fewer houses being built. All right. There's fewer workers available to go into civilian lines if a bunch of people are being directed into the Marines, right? Because it's either there's more people all of a sudden. It says, no, people who otherwise would have gone in the private sector are now going into the armed forces. Okay. So there's a sense in which the American people collectively must be consuming less than they otherwise would have. But in terms of who is it, it doesn't necessarily have to be spread out uniformly. And so what ends up happening is it's the lenders, the people who provided the funds, they're the ones in a sense who are paying for the war up front. And so whether you do it that way or whether you have it be that the U.S. government is the one borrowing, it's still the same thing economically. And so, and the rationale, the social benefit is the same either way. That given that a big contraction in private sector consumption has to occur in order to free up the real resources, the steel, the rubber, the fuel, and so forth, that need to be redirected into the war machine. So Americans collectively have to consume less in order to free up those resources to go make this other stuff. But they, in a sense, bargain among themselves to transfer the burden of that pain in a way that everybody finds mutually advantageous. Right? That's what's going on when resort is made to the credit markets. Okay, and so the Mises is saying, if for various reasons it might be more effective and with less friction if the government issues the bonds. For one thing, just to give you an idea, why is he saying? Because typically the government is going to be able to borrow on much better terms than individual households, or at least than some individual households. All right. So if in a sense the government is borrowing on behalf of the taxpayers, then the interest expense is going to be less than if the government just levies the explicit tax and says, oh, we're not borrowing, we're going to pay for it right now, by gosh. And then the households who don't want to bear the full brunt of that surtax right now, spread the pain out over time by going to the credit markets, well, they're going to pay a higher interest expense on that than if the government, in a sense, borrowed on their behalf and ran up the federal debt. Okay, so that's the idea. All right, so now the question is, okay, that makes sense, and I'm presumably giving you at least food for thought as to why it makes sense for a government, even though it has the power to levy taxes, why it might be socially beneficial when there, especially if there's an unusually large expense, to rather than just boost the tax bill that period, the full amount, but instead to only raise taxes a little bit, borrow the rest, and then over time run a surplus, or at least have the deficit be lower than it otherwise would have been, in order to get the gross level of the debt back on track over time. Because that like spreads the pain, it defers the pain out over time. Okay, so hopefully I've gotten you to at least see the rationale there and how that could make sense. So now, related question, and this is the one that we are seeking to answer here for the purposes of this episode. What if the federal government still wants to raise $1 trillion in order to fund a new effort to go fight Putin, but now they're told, oh, we also have this printing press. Does that change anything? That you can come up with the $1 trillion, like, so you're still not going to commandeer resources. You're just going to go and grab a bunch of steel and a bunch of fuel and so forth and say, hey, we need it to go fight Putin. Do your duty, comrade. We're not doing that. We're going to come up with US dollars, legal tender notes, or electronic deposits in order to convince people voluntarily to turn over their resources to the defense contractors and whatnot, and to pay high enough wages to get enough people to volunteer in the armed forces. So we're not using a draft. But to come up with the $1 trillion, what if instead of levying an explicit tax and instead of borrowing, what if instead we just create a new $1 trillion? We could do it that way, right? Because these $1 trillion are just as much legal tender as anything else, pre-existing ones. So the government could do that and just go in and enter the markets and voluntarily acquire goods and services and pay people high enough wages with money they just printed up. Why don't they? What if they did that instead? Wouldn't that be a painless way of doing it? Or okay. So before I answer that question, let me first take a little bit of a detour and just walk you through to make sure you understand how is it that inflation could allow the government to finance its expenditures. Like what's really going on under the hood? Let's start with an easy one. Let's say the government is just going to give one household an extra $10,000 that it created, like 100 new $100 bills, and it just hands it over to some random household. Do those people feel wealthier? Yes, of course they do. They go out, they're spending the money. They have fancier cars or what, that helped them. That household was richer. Is the economy as a whole up $10,000 in real goods and services? And I hope you're seeing the answer is no. If it's not as obvious, change it. Suppose the government prints up $1 trillion in new cash, new currency, and picks 100 million households and gives $10,000 to each of them. And now they all go out and buy all kinds of new stuff. All right. Can it be that the households collectively are $1 trillion wealthier because of that, measured in terms of real goods and services? And I hope you can see that the answer is no. Yes, the people who got that money, especially if they get to the stores first, they might be able to acquire more goods and services, but that means there's fewer goods on the shelves, right? Or if they go and they start getting massages done, those masseuses aren't available to give other people massages. Okay, and what's going to end up happening, of course, is if lots and lots of households now have all this extra money, it's going to bid up market prices. And so unless you're going to tell some story about the fact that there was large-scale unemployment and it took this new infusion of cash in order to get everyone back to work. It's not that merely showering the economy with $1 trillion in cash makes people more productive. It doesn't make more crops shoot out of the ground. It doesn't make more cars shoot out of the factories. It doesn't make the programmers know more computer code. It doesn't mean that workers now don't need to sleep as much, right? Just the mere fact of showering an extra $1 trillion in cash into the possession of various households. So in real terms, you could think output is probably largely going to be the same, and it's just prices are going to be higher. Okay. Actually, I think it's going to distort things. And so over the long term, you keep doing that, the economy will be poorer in the long run, but put that aside. I'm saying just in terms of a quite naive analysis. One way of seeing this is if it really were the case that just printing up $1 trillion extra and handing it out, put it this way, if you give $10,000 of newly printed money to one household, they feel richer and they can go out and buy some new stuff or whatever, pay down some debt, what have you. And it's not like gasoline's going to jump to $20 a gallon, right? So they're not going to notice them pushing prices up. So doing it in small bursts, it might seem like you're helping one recipient without hurting anybody else. But I would argue that's misleading, that you actually are hurting other people, that it's not that you can make this household $10,000 richer without making the community any poorer. Because again, the way to see that is just keep multiplying it. You're certainly not making 100 million households all $10,000 richer by just printing up that money and giving it to them. Unless you're taking into account that when you say $10,000 richer, after the experiment, what $10,000 richer means is less significant than what it meant before the experiment. In other words, $10,000 doesn't buy you as much after you do that than before. Okay? So again, the point being, by the government printing up money and handing it out to households, it might make the individual recipient richer, but only at the expense of making everyone else poorer. Right? And this is why, in general, counterfeiting is socially harmful, destructive. Right? If you found out you see your neighbor down the street, all of a sudden, he was a mild-mannered guy and he drove an old car, beat up, and all of a sudden he's rolling in with Corvettes and other fancy cars. Has people come in and put in an in-ground pool. He's always having crazy parties and stuff. And you go up and you're like, "What? Did you get a new job or something?" He goes, No, I'm still a librarian. Well, how are you? And it turns out he takes you down to his basement and he's lit this. And he's got a laser printer. He's just cranking out $100 bills on weekends. And that's how he's funding this new high lifestyle. You wouldn't just be like, "Oh, good for you. You're providing," well, if you were Keynesian, you might. But no, if you're a good economist, or you've read Henry Hazlitt at least, you would know, oh, this guy is effectively stealing from the rest of us. It's not that for all these new cars and things that are in his driveway, either they would have been in other people's driveways and now they're unaffordable, or if the production of Corvettes now is slightly higher than it otherwise would have been, that still is real resources that were diverted from other lines into making more Corvettes, right? So still, somewhere in the economy, there are people who must be consuming less because this guy is consuming so much more. Because just him laser printing $100 bills in his basement is not making the economy physically more productive, that it can create more total goods and services year after year, just because this guy now all of a sudden figured out a way to crank out counterfeit $100 bills that evade detection. So if you get that, that's why counterfeiting is not cool. And in a sense, it's stealing from everyone else. Just because it's legal and the US government is doing it doesn't change the economic essence of it. So here, I'm not mixing in my value and morality judgments. You can say it's fine for the government to do it because they're the issuer of legal tender. Fine, go ahead. But I'm saying economically, if you understand why the guy down the street cranking out $100 bills is in a sense redirecting resources from everybody else, and so the community is in a sense paying for his higher lifestyle now because their lifestyles are now lower. Well, likewise, if the U.S. government comes into the markets with a fresh $1 trillion it just printed up, either literally in paper currency or electronically by the Fed buying assets and whatnot, then still, all those new tanks and bombers and man hours diverted into the war machine means Americans collectively have that much less to consume. And so that's the sense in which the American people are still paying for the war by their lower standards of living collectively. So if now the government right away just lets that $1 trillion rip and pays for the war immediately, well, the burden of that effective $1 trillion cost might fall disproportionately on certain households. So in particular, like retirees who are living on fixed income assets, maybe they have a pension or something that just pays a certain amount, maybe they have an annuity, maybe they have a bond fund that they're invested in. They have Social Security that theoretically is adjusted, has COLA adjustments, cost of living adjustments, but maybe they have a bunch of other things that supplement them, and so that their income is actually not very responsive to rising prices. So they're going to get killed if by the U.S. government financing the war just by running the printing press right away results in higher prices, and so then households collectively consume $1 trillion less in real resources than they did before because of the higher prices, right? So that's really the essence. If the government finances the war by just levying an explicit tax, it doesn't create more dollars in total. It just takes dollars from the households and puts them in the government's checking account, and then it spends it. So the total number of US dollars in existence doesn't change. If instead the government creates an extra $1 trillion in money, well, then the IRS isn't sucking money out of anyone's bank account. So they feel like, oh no, I'm still okay. I'm not paying for this war. But then when they go into the marketplace, they see prices are a lot higher than they used to be. So their money doesn't go as far. So either way, you still can't buy as much as you could before. And that has to be the case, right? Because again, the government can't magically create extra steel and manpower hours and so forth, even though if it has a printing press or if it has the IRS. It's still taking real resources away from potential private uses and redirect them into the war machine. So the American households collectively must be curtailing their consumption in the aggregate because that has to be the case physically. But in terms of each individual household, how does that necessity manifest itself? There, the government's financing decisions matter. And so again, if it's financed explicitly through taxation, the household says, oh yeah, we don't have as much in our checking account because the government said you owe us $10,000 or you're going to jail. And so that's why we don't have as much of it. That's why we can't buy as much. Sorry, kids, we can't go on vacation this summer because we just don't have the money. Whereas in the new environment, if the government finances it through inflation, the family still has the same amount of money in the checking account, but they say, sorry, kids, we can't go on vacation this summer because look, have you seen the prices? I checked and, the stay at the hotel now is triple what it was last year. And the admission price for the theme park is triple what this is crazy. So no, we can't go this year. So either way, the households realize they can't do what they originally wanted to do. It's just the way they experience that differs depending on how the government finances it. Okay, so if you think back, if you remember earlier in this discussion, why the government might not want to just levy the tax outright and say to everybody, you owe us $10,000 the next 3 months. And instead they might say, you owe us $1,000 the next 3 months. We're going to go borrow the rest of what we need. But then next year you owe us $1,000. And the next year after that, you owe us $1,000. And for 10 years, you owe us an extra $1,000 compared to your original tax liabilities and so forth. And that's how we're going to pay the war for the war. But we're going to spread the tax bill out over 10 years to make it more bearable for you. So they could do an analogous thing here where they'd say, yep, we're going to go ahead and spend $1 trillion fighting Putin. And we're not going to use taxation. We're going to finance it through inflation. But you know what? Instead of just letting it all rip right now, we're only going to print up $100 billion in new money. So the money supply is only going to rise by $100 billion. And then we're going to borrow the other $900 billion. So in this first year, the households collectively only have to restrict their consumption involuntarily by $100 billion, right? By seeing prices being higher. Whereas the other $900 billion of restricted private sector consumption is going to be from people who voluntarily bought more bonds from the Treasury. So they don't have that money anymore. They handed it over, so they can't go spend it. But to them, that's not privation. They don't feel like they're just out. It's like, no, I'm just deferring my consumption. That I had, whatever, $50,000 that I lent to the government by buying more T-bonds. So I certainly can't go buy more groceries or go to the casino with that cash because I don't have it anymore. But it's not just that I'm out the way I would be if it was an explicit tax, or the way that in real terms I would be out if just I had my assets and all of a sudden prices are a lot higher and I don't feel as wealthy as before. No, I gave up $50,000 in cash, but I have $50,000 in more T-bills or T-bonds, right? So I'm not poorer because of that. And so that's how it gets financed. Okay, so it spreads the pain out rather than having, it's over time doing that. Eventually, at the end of the 10 years, the price level has risen relative to what it otherwise would have done by the full amount of the new $1 trillion that's been created. But because the government only created $100 billion in new money per year and spread it out over 10 years, that shock was spread out, that the households only saw prices rising unusually rapidly, spread out over a 10-year period rather than having prices just jump up the full amount in year one in order to get their consumption to be restricted enough to fully pay for the war in that one shot period. Okay, so that's the element, that's what's going on there. So last point I'll make now is that, as I say, the MMTers don't understand that. And so just to show you that, in response to that viral Jared Bernstein clip, one of the gurus who was featured in the documentary, L. Randall Wray, so besides Stephanie Kelton, I think he was held up as like one of the economist gurus in this. So Warren Mosler was hailed as the founder of MMT, but he was like a bond market trader in the late 70s when he stumbled upon the interesting ways of looking at things that defied conventional wisdom that then later came to be called MMT. Okay, but Randall Wray and Stephanie Kelton are trained economists, and so they feature heavily in this documentary. And so when that clip of Bernstein fumbling around and not knowing why the government issues bonds went viral, Wray came out with an explainer piece himself, and he said, well, there's three possible explanations for why a government that has the ability to create new money without strings attached might resort to finance or deficit finance, floating bonds. And so he lists the three reasons, and he says, one, government must borrow to finance its deficits because printing money would cause massive inflation. Two, government must borrow to finance deficits because that's the law. And three, government sells bonds to reduce downward pressure on interest rates. Okay, so what we've all gone through here is reason number one. And so Wray is going to reject that. He thinks of these three choices. Reason number three is the correct one. And here, but it's interesting to see, this is what his explanation is for why one is incorrect. And he says, the first answer is wrong because all government spending, no matter the budget balance, takes the form of a credit to the recipient's bank deposit, which is included in everyone's definition of money. While the term printing is a bit misleading, since payments take the form of an electronic entry to a bank balance sheet, the point is that all government spending increases the money supply. If that caused hyperinflation, we'd have hyperinflation all the time. Okay, so this is frustrating, and this is the problem with trying to argue with the MMT people, is they shift the goalposts or they shift the framing and you can't nail them down. All right, so what he's done there, again, just to remind you, this is the theory, the hypothesis he was trying to blow up there. The hypothesis being government must borrow to finance its deficits because printing money would cause massive inflation. And so Wray is trying to show, no, that can't be the explanation, because whether or not the government borrows, the spending is always creating new money. And in the MMT framework, that's how they think. Okay, fine. But then in the MMT framework, issuing bonds destroys money, right? Because the MMT framework, they take the Fed and the Treasury and they combine them into this entity of the U.S. government. Okay, fine. And then they say, anytime the U.S. government spends, That's like new money being created and coming into the hands of the private sector, regardless of how it's financed. Okay, but then if they tax, that's money being destroyed, right? So that's how they view it. So they don't look at it like if the government levies $1 trillion surtax to come up with $1 trillion, then go pay military contractors. I would say that's just explicitly tax finance. That doesn't change the quantity of money. It's just taking an existing $1 trillion in the hands of the private sector, transferring over to the IRS, the Treasury, and then giving them back to defense contractors. So that it's just moving $1 trillion around the economy. That's not the way the M&T people view it as. No, the spending the $1 trillion to Lockheed Martin and so on creates an extra $1 trillion there. Then the IRS taxing people, and so they have to write checks to the IRS. That destroys $1 trillion. So we still end up at the same spot. It's just they think it's creation and destruction, whereas I think it's moving existing dollars around. Okay, fine. And so I'm saying, though, if you agree with that, if you understand that, then okay, in the MMT, or what I would say is that if the government spends $1 trillion, if the government issues bonds and raises $1 trillion that way and then spends it, it also has not increased the quantity of money. It hasn't changed. It's just moved the money around. Just like if a private corporation, if GE wants to raise $10 million to go build a new factory, so it floats bonds, people in the private sector give GE $10 million in money to get a new $10 million in bonds issued by GE, and then GE takes the $10 million and goes and pays people to go build a factory. That's just moved the money around, right? Nobody in that scenario has the legal authority to create legal tender money, right? Okay, so likewise, if the U.S. Treasury issues bonds and borrows an extra $1 trillion, so people in the private sector buy the bonds, their checking account balances go down, it goes up, and then the Treasury goes and spends it on fighter jets and whatnot. That just moved $1 trillion around. Okay. If the MMT people want to say, no, the very act of spending money on Lockheed Martin and whatnot creates $1 trillion, okay. But then for consistency's sake, when the Treasury sells bonds, new bonds into the market, it is destroying that money, right? The money people hand over to the Treasury to buy the new bonds disappears in the MMT world. And so that's been destroyed. Okay, so for Randall Wray to say, no, it can be that the government might want to issue bonds rather than running the printing press to pay for something because that would help limit inflation. That can't be because the very act of spending causes money to go up. And so, that he's missing the point, even within his own framework. Okay. Last thing I will say on that, because I know how these things go often, is some MMTer might say, oh, no, Bob, you don't get it because it's an asset swap, right? And so there's the wealth effect and and so that's why as long as the people are getting, and yes, there is such a thing as a wealth effect. And the idea is like if you own a bunch of stock and the stock goes way up, and so now you feel $1 million, like your net worth has gone up by $1 million, you might go spend more, right? And so, okay, but even so, if the government comes in and issues bonds and swaps, like the people there getting the money are not wealthier. All right, so there's that element. And finally, I mean, the most important point, crucially, money and bonds are different assets. Okay, and it's amazing. In the MMT world, a lot of times they almost treat them like they're interchangeable. And so, yeah, especially when interest rates are low, in certain contexts, especially like if you're an institutional money manager, having literal cash sitting in a checking account versus having T-bills rolling over at 0.2% or something, they might be very similar assets. But still, bonds are not money. You cannot go into the grocery store and use a bunch of treasuries to buy groceries. You can't roll up to the gas station and fill up your car and hand over a T-bill. No, you need US dollars because they're money. Okay? And so when we're wondering, inflation's too high, there's too much money chasing too few goods, the fact that the government issuing bonds sucks money out of the private sector's hands, that matters. So we can quibble about the magnitudes and so forth. But I'm just saying, Ray there just completely ignored that element of it. And that's really par for the course with trying to talk to these people. So with that, I will wrap up. Thanks for your attention, everybody. I hope I have now shown you partly what's going on under the hood in terms of government finance, and really in terms of, well, how does this relate to current disputes? I would say be very wary of the MMT camp, because even though they might try to occasionally give caveats and whatnot, it certainly leads the average person to believe there's this whole fount of government spending that can occur that won't have corresponding pain to private households. That we can have a Green New Deal, we can have single-payer healthcare, we can have blah, 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 all this stuff, and that don't listen to these fiscal hawks who are saying, how are we going to pay for it? No. That a lot of what the MMT people are doing is just smoke and mirrors. And that I think that's very destructive to the public discourse. And so here I've gone through this particular example. I hope to show, to shed more light on how so-called public finance works. Okay, we'll catch you next time.
This concludes another episode of InFi, The Future of Finance, with Dr. Robert Murphy. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the host and for previous episodes, visit InFi, thefutureoffinance.io. Thanks for listening.